Hello. In this episode of the A is for Architecture podcast, I spoke to Berlin-based writer, activist and sometime architect Anna Kostreva about her 2023 novel, Seeing Fire, Seeing Meadows, published by Plural Studio. Described as archifiction, Seeing Fire, Seeing Meadows blends storytelling and architectural drawing to tell a tale of technology, agency and human connection, shot through with a sort of spatialized digital paranoia. Longlisted for the Ursula K. Le Guin Prize for Fiction 2024, Anna's book is the first novel, and Anna, the first novelist, that I've spoken about, or to, on the podcast, so it was all rather scary, but exciting.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the A is for Architecture podcast. I'm delighted to be talking today to Anna Kostreva. Anna, thank you for joining me. We're going to be talking about your novel, Seeing Fire, Seeing Meadows, which you published in 2023. It's a fascinating book, and I'm very grateful that you sent it to me. But before we start talking about that and some of the themes around that, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Sure, Ambrose. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to discuss the book with you. Give some background about myself. I am a daughter of Polish sort of immigration story to the United States around the 20th century, as well as to one of my grandparents was a Hatfield, which is known in Appalachia as sort of mountain people, hillbillies, or sort of bootstrap survivalists. And I grew up in South Carolina and then escaped the conservative South to New York City, where I studied architecture at Cooper Union, which is a really small school that some people will know about and others will maybe not heard about it yet, where we focused more on art and theory. And after I finished professional degree there, I had a Fulbright scholarship to South Africa to study post-apartheid Johannesburg for a year. And then I made my way to Berlin, where I've been living since, basically, with some interruptions. And my first sort of full-time working experience after college was with different offices here in Berlin, ranging between urbanism and interior and architecture. And after 7 years, I started my own projects and teaching. And so since 2010, since moving to Berlin, I've also been interested in works of theory and creativity, and Berlin has been really supportive for that kind of way of being in the world. And I managed to publish some books along the way. The first one was, it's called Berlin, A Morphology of Walls. And it's in German and in English. It's over 70 different cartographic explorations and analysis of the city over time, very top down. And then...
What do you mean by very top down?
Oh, very map-based.
Okay.
There are a few axonometric views of the urban scenario and some sections of the various walls, but for the most part, it's map-based analysis of the city. And then a few years later, 2015, I had the chance to publish some journals that I did while I was in Asia, in Japan and China. That book's called 3 Pathways to Get Anywhere. And my interest in that transition from that top-down way of working into something more subjective and trying to understand how I could theorize urban forces and urban life with text and images. And that kind of way of thinking then followed me around until I came up with the idea of writing this architectural novel, which I started in 2019. Seeing Fire, Seeing Meadows uses subjectivity as a tool to process urban experience and the contemporary moment, looking at architecture as part of a world building method.
Wonderful. What a great story. I'm interested. I want to go back to this Cooper Union. I've been having some discussions and trials recently, last week, where we were supposed to record, was the beginning of this period where I had been challenged about the nature of theory. And obviously you're very theoretically grounded, and your training at the Cooper Union obviously does that. How would you describe or define an adequate approach to theory for contemporary architecture? Now, that's a very hard question, but I think it does pertain to the book as well. And it's not a question I sent to you beforehand, so you're going to have to think on your feet, which is mean.
That's fine.
Which is mean, but
I thought we might get there. In the end, I have something that might work for that, because I was just going back to my, let's say, the professor that during my time there affected me the most was Diane Lewis. And she has a great lecture on YouTube that she delivered at the Architectural Association, where she talks about Faust. And before Goethe wrote Faust, she is mentioning how the story of Faust actually was not based on a philosopher, but an architect, originally, the sort of Faustian narrative. And that that whole, let's say, struggle of Faust and the deal with the devil that he makes is to have great knowledge, but not to actually become an academic, be able to be someone that can act in the world. So I think that this problem of theory and practice is also about the combination around intersecting oneself as a historical actor and having intention and efficacy within the sort of visceral and physical parameters of the world. So maybe that's an attempt to understand how theory gets woven into practice and is part of becoming effective as part of history.
Yeah. Your book is a sort of, as I read it, it's almost like a theorizing of a future scenario, isn't it? But maybe we can come to that. I think it's very interesting the way that you've located the story. I was listening with my daughter, I was listening to Amy Winehouse this morning when she was at the peak of her powers according to my daughter anyway, at the peak of her powers in 2008. And what's remarkable about her and characters like her, Judy Garland, Whitney Houston, so on and so forth, is that they can situate themselves in the future. They're more mature than their age. There's this kind of prophetic vision to it. And I think, in a way, as I read your book over the last few weeks, that's how it feels. It's that you're starting to position yourself into a future scenario, to look back upon a condition of potential crisis, which I find really interesting. But can you tell me a little bit about this turn towards novel writing? Why did you feel that the novel was the right device? Was it a more appropriate device for engaging with this condition that you explore than an academic or theoretical book?
Yeah. So I think around 2016, 2017, I was finally coming to the point where I needed to make my ecological position for myself more clear. And I quit the job that I was working at, the office that I was working at the time, because I felt that I couldn't work there in the speculative real estate development, ecological, social crises that were going on all around, revolving around the production of architecture. And I thought to myself, well, look, some of my heroes, people that I think have done amazing work. It hasn't been necessarily about doing the most work you can do, like the most buildings to produce, but instead being very specific about what it is that one does. So from there, the ecological crisis led me to kind of believe that, look, I don't need to make a lot of buildings. I need to think about which buildings and with whom and how these things can happen. And so the novel kind of grew out of maybe a need for a way to explore architecture in that context. There are many other reasons why I chose the novel, but I think from what you just asked, that's a big one, to give myself and other people a room and a place for thinking and processing what architecture can even bring us right now, when, for all intents and purposes, we might be better off stopping to build, as you were also talking about in one of your latest podcasts with Charlotte Malter-Bartz, that there could be a moratorium and we need to think how to get back to building. And in another way, it's the novel becomes interesting to me as a way to think through our contemporary moment. So another person that I was really influenced by to think about the crisis is Sheila Mbembe. He's a Cameroonian political theorist, and he's kind of famous for his book Necropolitics, but he has also amazing lectures on YouTube, which I'm, as you can tell, I'm a pretty big fan of watching people talk or listening to people talk. And he talks about technological escalation and what that means for different people and different bodies, and how we have, through the oncoming digitization, artificial intelligences, basically a kind of wastage of human life. And then another dynamic, which is that data around our movements and our thoughts becomes part of what's being enclosed, right? So previously it was physical labor, and now it's psychological labor as we go through our feeds and things. So this crisis and trying to understand it made me think about like how I can work with architecture to talk about that problem, and what it would take, and basically kind of realizing that this is not going to be like a one-off design that's going to give me the ability to comment or build enough of a structure to help me figure out how we move in our contemporary moment. So I wrote a short story in 2019, or what I thought was a short story. Maybe it's the beginning to another novel, but I wrote a short story that was a little bit more about the idea of the sensitive. So someone that has the ability to feel, for instance, earthquakes on the other side of the planet. But the sensitives in my short story were actually interested in microplastics and the problems of xenohormones and how that was happening in different places and the crises there. And this work somehow led me to think, there's something I can do here spatially. I can start to bring in a text of architecture and a text of narration. And then I got a comment about that short story that maybe it would be better off as a novel. And then the novel Crime and Punishment came back to me. So a novel that I read as a teenager, and I hated it, actually.
It's often those ones that influence us the most, though, isn't it?
Yeah. So I went back to Crime and Punishment and reread it and realized it's also hilarious as an adult. So kind of interesting to hear what you're talking about with Amy Winehouse, which is, let's say when I was 14 or 15, I was not able to conceptualize just how ironic or relevant so many of the things Dostoevsky was dealing with in Crime and Punishment. Maybe it was the translation as well, but a more recent translation gave me that book as, let's say, one of the main character development and structural influences for figuring out how to write, because I'm not interested in actually becoming something else than an architect. Weirdly enough, even though I love to do many different things, and that to me is part of being an architect, is wanting to be part of all of these different ways of producing culture, producing practice, producing space. I don't want to change my profession, but I'd like to expand it. So I've expanded how I think architecture can work into the architectural novel, rather than saying, now I'm going to be a novelist. I still practice architecture. I'm working on building projects and teaching architecture. And I want to expand my practice to be able to also process our ever increasingly complex world by using the narrative novel structure. And so the interesting thing about Crime and Punishment was that basically he wrote that in 1866 as a way to process his time period of the Enlightenment coming into Russia and the problem of logic being proposed as something more important than tradition. And so the main narrative thrust there is the internal struggle of the main character who tries to use logic and commits a crime. And then the rest of the novel revolves around him trying to deal with his own self-punishment and undoing of what the ramifications of that logic could or should mean among all of these other sort of moral characters. So that I found to be, like a great tool to think about literature and the literary as a method of processing the world. And so that's how I got to the novel.
I can see the link there with your own book of Seeing Fire, Seeing Meadows, with, I suppose, the central protagonist of your novel being the character of Winter, other than the narrator themselves, who I think of as Anna Kostreva, to be quite honest, who, without spoiling it for readers, acts in a rational way, is it, or an emotive way? Is she acting in relation to what she sees as a kind of logical tyranny, or is she the logical one within that? And obviously then the unfolding impact of that in relation to this action that she takes. And the action takes place in a future scenario, as I understand it, but it could be a contemporary scenario in which reality is increasingly curated by online platform. And there's a lot of anxiety around that at the moment, and the way that that's curating people's imaginations and their experiences of space, and also the way it's structuring social relations and producing discordance, huge amounts of discordance in the world through misinformation, through scandal mongering, through the generation of bullshit to advance advertising. So I quite like this. I quite like having explained that narrative link back into Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. But when I was reading it, I was thinking, well, I can see China de Mieville's The City and the City. I can see 1984 very strongly. I can see the Book of Revelations very strongly in the kind of tone of end times or pre-end times that seems to characterize it as well. And there's a lot of other things, Brave New World, and there's been many iterations of this moment. And you've talked about the ecological crisis. Is there, in your reading of space, in your reading of the city as we find it, is there a comparable crisis to hand in urban space as there is in the kind of ecological crisis?
I think the city is part of the ecological crisis. We have like an overwhelming amount of land transformation to basically hard surfaces. People like to put the onus of climate change on fossil fuels, but if you change the surface of the planet from being covered in plants and earth that's available to the sky to one that is covered with hard surfaces where the water can't penetrate and life can't break out, then that is fundamental to any carbon cycle that would create an equilibrium or balance. So I think that the city that we have right now is a full-on, not only for all the reasons that are really much more talked about more regularly, and as far as the use of fossil fuels to energetically heat our buildings or to create the materials, but just the transformation of the surface of the planet is a huge ecological crisis, whether that's into cities, single family houses, or mines that just pull rare earth materials out of the ground, right? So the whole extractive process.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I think that's fair enough. I'm going to assume, that you're at least a generation younger than me.
I don't know if I am.
I think you are.
Okay.
I've just got really good filters on my camera.
Okay, good.
I wonder whether this is a particular concern for your generation. I know, for example, again, to go back to this issue around the theorizing and your mentioning of Charlotte Montebar episode that I released last week, there is certainly a recalcitrance amongst the older generation of architects to countenance the possibility that much needs to change and that actually architecture can carry on, but needs to start using a bit more wood. I think that might be the solution. A bit more wood and a bit more collective housing and photovoltaics. I'm not sure. But it seems to me that the younger generation of architects coming through in the way that it's being taught and thought about is much more a political idea of architecture. Is that how you have learned to think about it? Or is this something that is, I mean, I can't get you to speak for everybody, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you think that this is where the discipline is headed?
I think that this first picture that you're painting of just some slight changes, I would agree that this is impossible to marry with a future where our planet can be saved from climate disaster and massive amounts of human extinction. So
Whoa.
that's I think where I see it. And the book Seeing Fire, Seeing Meadows, basically for me, while the sum of the book seems to be dealing with the problems of digitization, it's because that has created the alienation that we have to the physical world. And so it's necessary for us to understand, or for me to have worked with that, the issues of the digital as an accelerating mechanism that promises efficiency, that promises us all kinds of things. The book goes into this idea of applications that can promise you everything that you might want out of your life, which is what technology generally tends to do, is works on a promise. But then if you look at, for instance, Tim Jackson's work into prosperity without growth, he has studies where he points out that efficiency has never led to reduction. So the more efficient our technology becomes, the more likely we are to just use more of whatever resource it is that we have or are using.
Yeah, you get that very clearly in your book, where even though the characters are, and I don't think, again, I'm giving anything away, but the characters themselves are unhappy with the curation of their lives. In fact, not the curation, but the production of their lives by mobile technology. They are constantly referring to their phones. And it's this, I've been enormously struck by it. The narrative around efficiency and around ecology that has somehow become buried within the ever escalating consumption of materials in forms of our phones and in energy, and the things like the energy crisis producing vast quantities of deforestation, or vast areas of solar panels, or vast areas of wind turbines, ostensibly so that we can go shopping on our mobile phones 24/7, 365. It's really wild. But your characters still can't leave the phones behind.
No. And I don't think technology should ever be cast as positive or negative in itself.
Okay.
We are within a world where we're constantly, through human ingenuity, developing and changing things. But what I think for me is important is something that, like, I also have from Silvia Federici, who's a Marxist feminist. She says that technology that we have today has also been developed within capitalism. So we need to think critically about how those tools were produced in the first place, and the conflicts and the reasons why they exist and for whom they were made. So that's, I think, when you talk about Winter as the main character and this hack, or this crime that she commits in the story, it's somehow dealing with taking on that world of living in a system that's just so fundamentally broken in its buildup, and how can you possibly act within that fractured way of being in the world, where it's built off of hierarchies and it's built off of extraction. And then you are automatically within those streams of extractive processes. And where can anyone, whether you're an architect or even, let's say, a cashier or a waitress, or where can we fit into this system and also negate it and work on creating alternative worlds to that system. So that's, I think, what also fascinated me in developing all of the other characters, was figuring out how, even though we are living in a world that is where our technology has been fundamentally set up for a funneling of resources toward the elite, there are people in Berlin that I encounter and that I find super fascinating and end up having conversations with over the years, that show me that actually there are little peninsulas and possibilities of acting differently, and reading David Graeber, for instance, also an anarchist anthropologist, gives me ideas about ways that even though we say we're living within capitalism, actually within a family environment, within the office, there's actually socialism and communism happening at the same time. So there are ways to maybe imagine the technologies that are being developed to do different things, and who can do that, and how do we meet each other in that world? Another reason to sort of write a fiction and imagine these people, and then come back to the world with a few more ways of thinking to create these islands and peninsulas out of the technology that, as you say, it seems just to be built up to make it easier for us to go shopping on the internet.
Or more often than not, watch badly edited reel videos whilst having pop-up adverts for shit that I will never buy, like linen dresses and sanitary wear and muscle powders. I get so many adverts for bulking up muscle powders. Anyway, whatever. It's the word. I don't.
Well, to be honest, we're almost living in a hell right now of as far as our online experience goes, especially, I mean, in Europe. You have these pop-ups coming up every single website asking you if you agree to the cookies. And then on top of that, as you say, the things we're being fed have so little relevance. And yet we're being convinced by ChatGPT that we can get our answers within milliseconds to any possible question. But when you look deeper into it, the facts have been just fabulated for you. Yeah. So it's really quite a hell landscape. And in a way, my book is almost utopian, I think, despite its sort of, as you mentioned, kind of like 1984 aspect of surveillance capitalism being very clearly referenced in there. The promise of the novel is something that would be so easy and likable, to have an app on your phone where you didn't have to even look at your phone anymore, to enjoy the sort of possibility of where this digitization could go. Because actually the inspiration for the Subs app in the book, which is sort of the main fictional technological idea for the book, comes out of this idea of sort of almost even the socialist calculation of all of the world's requirements. And if you could just calculate what we all need so that it's all there just in time, then we would have we could have a fair use of resources, and everyone would just be told just exactly how much they needed to work in order for all of that to happen, without having actually a market economy. So the dystopian world that I created in the book is actually, in some ways, very much a utopian suggestion that is played against some of the other characters who try to create even more fair situations.
Yes. I suppose that's what companies like Palantir are promising, isn't it? I think Palantir is the bogeyman at the moment, but I suspect there's other ones. This idea of a kind of the use of big data in an effective manner, because at the moment, obviously, we don't have the energy or the processing power to deal with all of the data that's being produced. But if quantum computing comes on stream, so I am reliably informed by people in the pub, all of this will be completely doable. And the utopian dystopia that you propose, it will come to pass. I mean, I think that is the trajectory, isn't it? That all you're describing is, as you say, it's a desired endpoint, a stated desired goal for a lot of political and corporate or politico-corporate, or, well, however you want to describe the reality of our political system now. That's where they're heading.
Unfortunately, I think that my novel's too optimistic. My real stance is much more pessimistic.
Oh, gosh.
Because I think that companies like Palantir or the Trump administration among other governments, their intention is to deal with superfluous peoples and superfluous populations in a much more violent way than to integrate them into a calculation which would allow people to, let's say, survive. What I experienced when I lived in England for 2 years, 2022 to 2024. I don't know if you see it when you live there all the time, but it's really a class war going on in everyday life in England. And the divide between just the poorer populations and the more elite populations in Europe and in the United States is just so drastic that I fear really for people's lives that are more and more dropping off into poverty. And there will not be this subs app that will somehow even tell them what to do. They'll be gathered up for prison. They'll be told there's no one that can help them at the hospitals. So I don't. Yeah, I'm certainly not optimistic that the digitization is offering enough of a promise right now. What I think that it's offering is mostly police.
I would like to understand better your approach to architecture within the book. It is something like an architecture book. It's got that kind of quality about it. And it's got drawings in it, hand drawings in it, which I assume, you drew as a way of kind of interrogating aspects of the story that are not entirely conceivable through language, which I think is a really elegant device. Could you talk a little bit about the architectural imagination of the book? What is the space this book takes place in? And how is that architecture framed, as I read it, at least, the architecture is framed as a significant character within the discourse?
Great, thanks. I love this reflections and questions. So I'll bring up one book that was also an influence from my thinking about literature, which is Jealousy by Rob Grier. And in that book, he attempts to create a new genre of something that's called like the new novel, in which it's basically pure description. And the reader is left to intuit what the emotions might be of this narration, which is definitely from two eyes. Like the narration is what is going on from a person that's seeing the world through blinds, and actions are happening and meals are being eaten at a table and all kinds of things are happening. But you are left as the reader to decide kind of how you feel about what's going on. And I found that really fascinating as a spatial tool as well, to think how description can lead to the interaction of a reader to be a collaborator in the creative production. So I think that is maybe in this book, the text itself works pretty much like a standard novel, but the text of the drawings ask more of the reader to um, do some work, because the drawings are plans and sections for the most part of architecture projects that the characters are visiting throughout the novel. So that means that as a person is reading this book, they have to look at the elevation, look at the section, look at the plan, and kind of build each of those spaces. And that means that they're active in making the architecture, and that you know, they have some agency also in what it becomes in their own head. Their fantasy, their imagination is part of the book. And then, as you mentioned, I used hand drafted drawings. This also comes out of my previous book, Berlin: A Morphology of Walls, which I also did hand drafted or hand drawn maps. So dozens and dozens of cartographic analytical drawings for that. And for me, that point in time with the mapping, but it continues now, is that a hand-drawn, drafted architectural drawing still communicates a subjectivity to me that's important in a world where we have more and more digital maps like Google Maps or photographs and CAD drawings and renderings that attempt to portray facts to us, like how things will really be, how it will really look, or how it really is already. And for me, putting something like a hand-drawn plan in a book is quite like a provocation to the reader to say, you are going to be participating in what this really is. And I, as the author, and the drawings in the book are supposed to have been done by the narrator. They are fallible and subjective. And actually all of the material that we see in the world is fallible and subjective, but here it's transparent for you to see, like my hand and the pencil going across the page. So that is something important to me, to connect subjectively across space and time with the reader, as a way to also encourage creativity in everyday life. That I'm there at the same time as they're there. They have also the capacity to be a creative agent in their life. And I want to see them at that level of, us meeting in this book. So there's something kind of romantic, I guess, even about that.
Yeah, I do get that, and I'm interested in this word subjectivity, which is obviously quite a main character of the postmodern condition. This kind of preferencing or elevation of the subjective, which others have argued, and certainly it seems strong to me as a link with neoliberalism, that in a way the attempt to facilitate the subjective person is principally a device for creating individuated consumers, which is about the shift from the individual as citizen to the individual as consumer. And whilst you were talking about about your drawing, I was thinking about Oswald Unger's drawings of Berlin, a Green Archipelago. And I was thinking then about where he creates these drawings of these moments within a city. And in a way, he's proposing that the city's cognitive map is produced through these moments of intention, the intense architectural, the Kreuzbergs and the Bundestag and so on and so forth, the remnants of the wall and so on. And for me, that's quite an interesting tension in your own work, is that, and in work generally speaking today, is that on the one hand, we want to believe in the subjective self, and on the other hand, it's an extraordinarily useful device for neoliberal capitalism and for the packaging up of the whole person into a product to be sold to, well, not a product, a consumer to be sold to, whether it's that's our sexuality or our sex or our identity or our tastes or our appetites. So like there, for me, there's this kind of wrestle at the center of the book, which is a subjective book. It is a postmodern book. And at the same time, there's a kind of difficulty with that. And the character Roy, is it? I believe it's Roy in the book. Sid, sorry. Sid and Roy are very similar names in England. The character Fid wants to extract herself from all of this. And she's kind of presented as this character who is naive, like she's not wise to the operation of the system, but she's the one that actually wants to go back to honest toil, the good earth, the clean air, and get the hell out of the subjective, amorphous, ambivalent world of technology. I don't know if there's a question in there. There might be a question in there. Would you like to try and find a question in there?
I can just continue the conversation because you're on it with this book. Really, some of the motivation around it is the struggle around individualism. And in not only do we have to stop building, so in my kind of view of like, okay, how do we work with architecture? There's a sort of grieving in the book also around the end of maybe the great genius role of the architect. So there's something about the individualism in society that's very neoliberal that has now come to an absolute like climax around the Starchitect, which we're seeing devolve in front of us for good or into what is a sort of question what that ends up being. But that individualist world is something that also at the moment in time when maybe women have a chance to be genius architects, it feels like there's no space or very little space for these new ways of acting in the world to have agency. So this is, I think there's some tension around, well, how does individualism work today? And in a world where I'm interested in resisting some of these capitalist forces, looking at also Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, she has a great set of characters in there that deal with the same problems of social community versus individual. How can the individual move forward in a world that's constantly telling them how to be? But in, I guess, my experience of writing the book is that this book right now is only at the point of kind of this grieving stage. And I hope that maybe other books will deal with the idea of collaborative working together in a much more productive way than this one. So that's kind of part of my outlook for the next architectural novel is thinking more collaboratively in its production. And
do you mean in the character of the story itself, starting to look at the way that architecture can be framed as a collaborative practice, or do you mean actually in the production of the book itself?
Both, okay. Yeah. I think
the other thing is that we're framed, as you said, for neoliberal capitalism to work, it wants to market to each of us as individual consumers that have specific identities. So like in the book, there's even a cemetery to the digital individual and a cemetery to digital identities. So this is in some ways something that we need to get past, the way that we are formed by these systems. And the book kind of proposes that we might need a cemetery to grieve our expectation of being catered to as a digital individual or a digital identity. But I think this where we're faltering is this a little bit the idea that because we've been brought up in an environment of individualism, that making artistic expression as an individual act is an individualist thing to do. But I don't believe those things are the same, um, because expression is also part of being in the world. And what has happened in the economic system that we have and through architectural systems that we have is we've actually reduced artistic expression and creative expression really to the point where the machines are almost making the expressions for us. And this is a sort of a question is like my my emphasis would be that each person has room for their own flourishing creative world. And that might not be as big as the large creative architectural genius then, but there has to be room for each person to take on that human world of expression without it just feeding into the neoliberal methods.
Does that creativity sometimes look like hacking? Is the creativity that you're talking about always artistic in the kind of, I suppose, mainstream sense of that, of material and plastic arts, or is there a creativity in the character of Winter and in the character of Tarek and the description of the resistance within your book?
Yeah, I don't think it's at all limited to visual, visual or musical or aesthetic art forms. What I'm talking about with creativity.
It's sort of design in the general sense, as designers being the human activity. I was interested when you were talking earlier about, and this is again an off-piste question, but I want to know about the influence of Berlin itself on you and your imagination, and whether you think that there is a link here. So I was thinking back to the famous paper article by Georg Simmel, The Metropolis and Mental Life, where he talks about the kind of overwhelming quality of the metropolitan world. And this is in, I think, 1903, he's writing about Berlin.
Mm.
And how in that space, the rural to urban migrant, and I count myself amongst that, is overwhelmed, can't deal with it, shuts down, becomes quite rude. And if you go to London, that is pretty much what you experience. And then identifies within that the people in their community through identification symbols, which is quite like what happens in your book, that the world seems, the way that you describe it, seems to be quite an amorphous and indistinct place, very dominant, but not particular, outside the designs that the narrator produces. And what they find is these individuals, what Kurt Vonnegut calls, people in your karass. But I'm quite interested in the influence and the impact that you might be able to trace in this particular place that you've chosen to live in. Did it inspire the book? Is it a Berlin story?
Yes. I think that probably first and foremost, it's inspired by the people, but I think your analysis of the description of the city also relates to my experience of Berlin and maybe even back to thinking about the Green Archipelago from Ungers, because I don't know how much time you've spent in Berlin, but there are many neighborhoods here which are built up basically to the sixth floor, and the streets just are very homogeneous in the sense where it's one level and it just goes from block to block, the same height of building, the same street width. It's very regular. And then every once in a while, there'll be like a monster, the Ludwig Leo Bau or the ICC or something that really just stands out and it just feels like where did this come from? How did this possibly appear here? Um, so there's something, I think the book more or less kind of describes the homogeneity of the city of Berlin, while then proposing, like with the anarchist library at the beginning, one of the places that the characters visit, that then there are these little back pockets where this strange wasp nest like architecture could exist, or that maybe underneath a building some quite imaginative space could exist. And so, in that way, spatially, I think it relates to Berlin but as a Berlin story, it's also just a question of where Berlin could go more than an analysis of it at the very moment, I think.
In your book, the architect is an observer of events and is not, in my reading of it at least, is determinedly not involved, sort of fraternizes with the political agents, the activists, empathizes with them, understands them, but decidedly doesn't implicate themselves, which I think is, I don't know, is that a fair reading of it? But if that is the case, is that something that you feel is true to architecture in its present moment? And is the proposition that you're making as an architect that architects do need to sort of start to have some skin in the game, to start to implicate themselves and understand the implications of their own actions within broader social, political, cultural, environmental, economic forces?
Yes. So I really like your reading, and I would say while Natalie, the narrator, in the text doesn't seem to have a character development, the buildings that she draws maybe act as her character development. At the same time, she hasn't managed to figure out exactly how to be political. And I think the architect in this book, like, is a kind of stand-in for the reader to put the reader inside of the story and give them a subjectivity within the story. And so there's a push there to ask the reader about their own agency, and which which other characters they would fraternize with or build with, or whether they would move out to the countryside with Sid or build Silentia retreats. You know, who exactly would be the right person to come together with to do architecture in a world with so many conflicts going on. And so that, for architects reading the book, works towards another set of ideas of self-narration that I've been thinking about. So I also wrote an article on drawing matter about John Haydock and the House for the Inhabitant Who Refused to Participate, which is a project he did for Venice, that's kind of one of his wall houses. But then there are a number of rooms that hang off of the wall, and each individual room has an individual function. So it has a bed or a sink or a toilet or a desk or a chair. And then one room is empty, and it looks out across this square to a tower where the tower has a mirror exactly across from the room. And so, like I said, the name of this house is the House for the Inhabitant Who Refused to Participate. And that room that looks across to the mirror suggests itself as the place in which one refuses to participate. And yet one looks across to a mirror, which ends up also being a two-way mirror. So someone can go up into the tower and observe from the other side of the mirror this person that's refusing to participate. However, on top of that, there's a stand where people from the urban sphere could watch, or could even lock the person that's gone up in the tower to observe the inhabitant, could lock that person in the tower. So I explain this entire scenario of a quite precisely convoluted set of spatial dramaturgies to say just how difficult it is to refuse to participate, how difficult it is to even observe to refuse to participate when in a society that is watching us at all times. So my interpretation of that situation is that Haydock is also an architect that did very little building. He refused many sort of ways of acting in the world, and he was also watching Italy in the 1970s, where there were architects that were also refusing to participate. And as an American, kind of being unable to really express a, let's say, like anti-capitalist sentiment, I think this project works to discuss just how difficult it is to move into the political. And so that project for me is when I started to look at it, reveals the wall, the vertical section, as a understanding of the present moment, which Hajduk develops over his career through the diamond houses and the wall houses as a way of understanding the phenomenological. And at that moment, he's able to actually sweep past the present moment and move into the political when he starts doing his mask projects. And for me, for this book, it's pretty obvious to anyone that knows Hajduk's work. If you look at the cover of the book and you look at the last projects that they're referencing, the wall projects, and there's, to me, exploration around our present moment as being one of alienation that is stuck, not just away from the physical world, but fractured between watching extinction happen and superfluidity, where we're just so meaningless in the world, where the jobs that we have are totally bullshit for the most part. And we look out and just want to feel comfort. So we're kind of fractured between a totally cozy world where nothing means anything, and then looking out in the other direction and seeing forest fires and genocides taking place. So that's where the architect is sitting right now, um, in this kind of fractured, alienated space, and asking ourselves, like, how can we get out of our present moment and into, yeah, a more political and intentional way of practicing.
It is perhaps ironic that you choose to use fiction to express this. Is that fair?
Is it ironic?
Rather than building itself.
I think that I see books like my like many of the people that I've been talking about very practically as a way to engage people and to get ideas out into the world. So I think my work as an architect on projects like the Bravos Foundry, in helping a family with an extension where they did some of the work themselves. So I really actually believe that people that are able physically and interested to build their own spaces, and in community projects like the work that we Plural Studio, my practice, did in Bristol, where young people get involved in programming and designing the interior spaces of a creative enterprise hub where they'll have space to connect and develop their careers, are all political projects where I've been working on bringing these ideas into affect the people that I have direct client relationships with, so to speak. But I think as anyone that looks at, let's say, Corbusier's work, he wouldn't be nearly as interesting to us if he didn't publish books, if he didn't write down his ideas. And the same about Hajduk, and the same for me about so many people. You can easily drop off the map, and that's fine also to not have to have the impact at your local level and with the people that you work with directly. But I find it rewarding to also work work in the book form.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not asking you for self-justification. I'm just prodding the bear in a weird kind of way. Because I think it is, to circle back to the beginning of our conversation, I think there is something very interesting in the idea of architecture as a speculative device, and that it's about more than gilding the capitalist lily. That it's great at doing that. I love going to castles, I love going to stately homes, I love looking at fancy buildings covered in gold, same as everybody else. The whole international tourist trade is based upon that idea. But at the same time, I do find this idea of the apolitical architect disappointing, obsessing about plans and not thinking about the broader context of the generation of their work. Anyway, I didn't want to have the last word on this, but I think that's a good point to finish on. Thank you very much, Anna, for taking the time to speak with me. It's been amazing.
Amazing. Yes, very much. Thank you to you as well, Ambrose.
We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings. Resistance and change often begins in art, and very often in our art, the art of words. Or, when you light a candle, you also cast a shadow. Both quotes from Ursula Le Guin, and both pertinent here, particularly to Anna's book. Thank you to Anna for sending me the book, for making contact, and then for tolerating my questions. It was a real pleasure. Please see the podcast description for links to Anna on social and professional profiles and to the book. Check it out for yourself. See what you think. And thanks for listening.